One of the big takeaways I heard was like, and I studied game theory in college. I was an economics major. They were saying that they took a game theory approach to sales. So they'd actually go in and whiteboard out the different ways that the conversation could go and preempt that so they could really understand a flow. I do that on like a smaller scale. And if you're not familiar with game theory, go to GPT, Gemini, whatever your AI of choice is, and ask for a rundown of the prisoner's dilemma. And you can apply that framework to your deals. Going back on it, I would just be not as concerned with every call, and I wouldn't be beating myself up as much on metrics. I would just enjoy the moment and focus more on learning from the mistakes and trust the process, understand that what happens to you at 23 won't define your career. I think my best mistake was a deal that very early in my career, I lost. And we figured out that the reason we lost the deal is that we weren't talking to the right people. Professionally, leaving Google. I've worked at organizations in the past where all of the focus is on Q4. My customer's fiscal year is June 30th of 2027 for when this biennium ends. They don't care about December. So I think to whatever degree organizations can better align around the way the customer functions in an enterprise that is calendar, the better outcomes there'll be for people. Do not make assumptions. Remember to ask questions. Remember to be curious. Do the little things right.
Hello, and welcome back once again to the Inquisitor Podcast with me, Marcus Cauchi. Today, my guest is Parker Mills. He is the author of a book called State and Local Government Sales Beyond the Bid. And today we're going to be talking about selling into government. For many of you, that's going to be an arcane and mysterious process, full of pitfalls. Many people that I've spoken to and trained over the years said that they don't want to touch government sales. Now, Parker comes from selling into the US government sector, but many of these issues will be the same selling into the UK as well. So without any further ado, Parker, welcome.
Thank you, Marcus. Appreciate you having me on today and excited to get to chat.
Pleasure. Could you give the audience 60 seconds on your history so that we understand how you got to this point?
Totally. So I am from Florida, currently live in Washington State. When I was in Florida in college, I started doing a bunch of random sales jobs as I tried to kind of find my path. I was doing newspaper advertising sales, also doing loyalty application sales and doing wine activations. And I was that guy at the grocery store trying to sell you vitamins Saturday and Sunday morning. So had my hands in a lot of different pots, and then eventually got lucky and stumbled into a tech sales role at Citrix in South Florida. That put me through a really great sales training program. It's through that program that I discovered state and local government sales. 11 years later, I now live in Washington State, where I've been working with government agencies on the West Coast. Have been fortunate to work for Oracle, did some time there before going to Google for 4 years, and I'm at ServiceNow for the last 2 years. And during my last year, I've spent a lot of time putting together my insights and what I think is beneficial for most reps that are either getting into government sales or trying to be better advisors to their customers, and put together a guide that helps distill some of these insights that I've learned in a way that's not too preachy, so people can be better advisors and partners to their customers.
Excellent. So we're going to start off with exploring why selling to government feels broken. So you spent years selling into state and local government. What's it really like on the inside beyond all the cliches?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I commonly hear is that there's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of misconceptions or misunderstandings about public sector. Most organizations have a pretty small percentage of their investment or workforce dedicated to state and local, and enterprise is the tail that wags the dog, so to speak. So I think a lot of people just don't really understand the day in and day out of working in public sector sales, and they find it to be too complex or too regulatory. What I think is the truth is that it's a really rewarding career path where you have the opportunity to really get to know and understand your customers and help lead projects that lead to positive outcomes in the communities that you either live in or that you're selling into. Um, and while there is more bureaucracy, more checks and balances, it's not anything that's too crazy in terms of radically different sales motions. The only thing I'd say that is consistent is that you do need to be patient, and the sales cycles are a bit longer. On average, for my more enterprise deals, the sales cycle we've had is roughly 18 months, which I know would drive most people in enterprise crazy.
So what's true and what's just lazy sales and leadership thinking?
I think what's true is the patience piece. Like, you do need to really, you know, be measured. And because of the fiscal calendars that most government agencies have in the US, we have a lot of agencies that are on a biennial or every 2-year budget. There's 3 or 4 different, depending on the state, fiscal calendars, June to June, calendar year, so like December to December. There's some that are in August, some in October for 2 states in particular. So you have to really be mindful of those funding cycles and preempt them by being patient in planning for those next legislative or funding asks to get projects greenlit. So that part is definitely true. There is some more hurdles and more sophistication that you need in order to get projects off the ground. Um, what I think is blown out of proportion is it's not that different from any sales role in the sense that your goal is to find um, positive outcomes to drive for the customer, get to understand their pain points and their use cases, be a fabric of their organization and help them as much as possible. The only delta is really the timing. So I feel like especially if you look at common verticals like healthcare or even more large, complex multinational enterprises that have um, strong centralized management or operations, but have multiple field or branch offices, they're very similar in terms of how you'd sell to state and local. The main difference is the perception of the timing in which you can accomplish a deal in.
Again, we see that in the UK as well. So this is more US centric, but how are you seeing vendors react to the changes coming down from federal level right now?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is really trying to understand where match dollars are going. So in previous years, especially during the pandemic, states got a lot of funding from the federal government. That funding could be used based on a set piece of criteria. So you could coordinate projects around the allocated funding for a program, whether that's healthcare and public health research, whether that's unemployment insurance, food stamps, et cetera. We generally had a pretty, and this is, I'd say, going back to the misconceptions and the benefits. This is one of the benefits of state and local government or selling into government. Everything is public. So you're able to look at the legislation, look at the grant funding that's flowing down from the feds to an organization, and then come to them and say, hey, we noticed you're getting this. How are you approaching this program? How are you planning on distributing this? What is your strategy for applying for these funds? And you can generally um, build something around that with the customer. With the recent changes in Fed, what we're seeing is there's less certainty on the funding that's being passed down. And we're seeing funding that was already pre-approved by our government now be in question. So we're having to be a lot more focused in terms of what federal programs we're looking at in conjunction with the agencies we're partnering with to ensure that we're focusing on programs that actually have a good chance of funding. And that's impacting the way we strategize in out years too, because we're having to make assumptions on what the federal government is going to fund and put that in our planning for 2 to 3 years out in budget asks, which makes it a little bit challenging.
It sounds to me like there's a game of pin the tail on the RFP and calling it strategy to a large extent. Is that fair?
That's fair. Yeah, it's either the RFP or I'd even say the legislative or funding ask. Like way most states go after funding is they look at how much money do we have in our coffers, how much is the federal government giving us, and then we go, okay, this program generally gets a federal match of X. We're going to forecast in 2 years that we're going to be able to use 80% of that federal money for this program. If in 2 years that's not the case and there is a change in that federal funding picture, the state has to figure out how to make up that delta. That either means program cuts, layoffs, or using reserves to fund that. So it's making it incredibly challenging for organizations to really know what is the commitment from the federal government from a funding perspective.
Is that what you mean by playing beyond the bid? And if so, what does it mean in practice that sellers have to do to adapt to really sell beyond the bid?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I've met a lot of different teams and reps that are really good at, and a large amount of the system integrators have a great practice around this, like the Deloitte's, Accentures, et cetera, where they're experts at working RFPs, meeting requirements. They bring all the qualifications needed, and their bailiwick is winning these large public procurements. I think it's critical, especially for sellers that work at more mid-sized companies, to not get focused on these large competitive procurements and figure out how they can partner strategically with their customers, preempt some of these needs, be able to forecast accurately on what is the trend that's coming, what are the changes, whether it's because of federal policy, state policy, what are the things coming down the pipe? How can we work with those customers to come up with a solution outside of just waiting for a procurement to come out in replying to that procurement? So instead of being reactive, trying to be more proactive, work in tandem with your agencies and with your partners to bring relevant solutions and craft some of those narratives instead of simply waiting for a bid to come out.
This sounds to me like we've created our own mess. And so I'm interested in exploring the systemic dysfunction. that is generated by our own limiting beliefs, our own perceptions. So where do you see the biggest misalignment between vendors and agencies?
Yeah, I think the biggest misalignment, I'm going to go back to the comment on enterprise and commercial wagging the dog, is that I've seen a lot of public sector sales organizations be nested in a commercial uh, overhead, right? Like public sector is just one part of a commercial organization. So typically, a lot of the collateral, a lot of the enablement content, a lot of the food that the reps are eating from corporate are really tailored towards the wrong customer profile. They're not tailored towards state and local. So a lot of the incentives also are misaligned. So I think that's kind of the biggest issue I've noticed or challenge is really coming up with that. I understand my agencies and my customers. This is the way that we can map what we have on the truck to what they're doing and how we can align with how they operate versus letting whatever the corporate structure is that a seller is in, if they're not in a purely public sector focused organization, drive that narrative.
So if we look at how the dysfunction builds, what are you seeing government doing in terms of using AI, or is that really theatre? Is
Yeah,
that
that's a great
obviously?
question.
Thank you.
Yeah, because that's another example where, you know, if you watch any corporate customer event, keynotes, etc., all the talk is about AI, and that's obviously what's driving a lot of the U.S. economy further. So you can't, turn on YouTube and look at insert corporate name webinar without seeing whatever's happening with AI. And that innovation is necessary, it's needed, and it's very positive. And I think the outcomes that it'll drive for agencies that are struggling to operationalize around their customers, I think it'll help them greatly once there's more guardrails and policy around it. I think what we're seeing in the short term is it's so varied state by state, municipality by municipality. There's a lot of states that don't even have the ability for agencies to use generative AI. And that's because of security and data privacy concerns, uh, fear of what does that mean from a public perception perspective of if I'm a resident, do I want the government putting my data in an LLM? And some of that can be mitigated via the way that the solution or products are set up. But there's still that perception piece. And I think in government, there's more of a focus on we need to really make sure the rollout and the policy and the governance around these is done correctly before we bring stuff to market. So it's almost the opposite of a innovation or I3 type mindset where, we're going to test some things, we're going to get it out there, we're going to fail quick, and then we're going to iterate on this until we have something that really works.
Can you define I3 for those who are not familiar with the term?
Ideate, innovate, iterate. So it's like the innovation is a simple kind of framework for innovation best practices, typically used for product development or managing releases of different services in an environment.
Excellent. Okay, so if we think about the rapid change that's going on within the technology market, how is that affecting government decision makers who, by their very nature, are very unlikely to be that au fait with the technology? Because it seems to me that one of the problems with the way legislators and government buy is that they're working at a particular pace. Technology is working at an incredibly fast pace, and there's that huge disconnect there. What do salespeople need to do in order to meet the customer where they are and not then scare the living daylights out of them, so that they actually buy instead of end up in a ghosting cycle?
Great question. And I think especially for any SDRs, sales development reps, people that are being tasked with doing a lot of outreach to customers to book demos that might be listening to this, I think the main thing is always focus on what the customer or the agency is doing. Meet them where they're at, right? Like you might have a mandate to go out and do X amount of AI demos, or hey, we've got a new product that's coming out. It's some type of AI product, go sell it. That might be the directive from corporate. But I think you really need to understand where the customer is at, what they're doing. So, like, for example, I work with some agencies that can't use AI currently. We're more in the phase of, hey, what are the key areas and use cases, pain points that you're having? And then we'll discuss what this could look like in the future. But it's really focused around realistic, low hanging fruit use cases versus, hey, we're going to drastically shift. It's not that challenger sale of like, we're going to massively change the way your organization functions because we have this tool and we can totally innovate around the way you're providing services because that may not be feasible. Now, I will say there's a lot of agencies City of Seattle, where I live, just released a really cool AI strategy plan. They're doing a ton of pilots, a lot with their existing incumbent vendors, where they're testing AI out on existing processes, workflows, and data that they have. And that's a really great way to start to show progress with a limited scope. And we are seeing other states like Alaska has an awesome AI center of excellence that they've spun up through their central IT organization. So I do want to make it clear that not all government is lagging, but I think the pitch that you see most vendors go forward, which is this insane transformation, totally shift the way that you do everything. I don't think we're quite at that point yet in government.
So, given that tech is sprinting and government's walking, who's responsible for closing that gap, the vendor or the agency?
Huh, that's a good question. I think, the politically correct answer would be it's a partnership, right? And as much as we can have seat at the table from our customers in advising and giving feedback to the vendors that they work with, that'll only help us continue to partner better and help with greater alignment at the corporate strategy level at whatever vendors are partnering with an agency. Because I find that most good corporations do take feedback from customers seriously and change their go-to-market strategy based on whatever that relevant feedback is. Um, in the meantime, I think it's up to the sellers, it's up to whoever those points of contact are that are working with an agency to be centralizing that feedback, communicating back what they're discovering in conversations and in meetings with them, and ensuring that they're taking it on themselves to align the customer strategy to what is on the truck with the vendor that they're with.
It feels somewhat like selling Formula One to someone who's still trying to drive a bus route. How do you help
That's a
buyers
great
who,
analogy.
thank you, how do you help buyers who are smart but not tech fluent make sense of all of this noise without feeling stupid or salty?
Yeah, and one thing I will say is I feel like most of the customers I work with are incredibly savvy and eager. I mean, we've got um I'm going to use an example if anybody happens to listen to this that knows him, but Scott West here in Washington for Ecology. I mean, he's been telling me about all this stuff that AI can do pre me even toying around with some of the consumer based tools. Like I think we have people that have a really strong understanding of the tech and of the use cases. To your point on uh, Formula One versus a more of like a training car. I think it's really working with those smart people that understand the technology at the customer and then figuring out in partnership with them what are the policies, what's the directive, what are the use cases that meet those things that we are allowed to do, and then just really focusing on how can we solve that one thing. I feel like there's two trains of thought when it comes to account strategy that I've seen. It's we're going to take a wider approach and we're going to say, how could we solve every facet of the business? What's this kind of end to end approach of everything that we could feasibly do? And that's not a bad approach. I'm not saying that that's not needed. And depending on the amount of penetration you have in an account or the direct partnership you have, that could be the right approach. But I feel like specific to some of the more uh, bleeding edge, newer AI tools, it's really about starting small, meeting the customer where they're at again. It's not, hey, we're going to apply AI across the enterprise. It's what is a single process that we could find. That's a good place
Lovely.
to start.
Well, what I'm seeing is salespeople have a tendency to accidentally trigger buyer fear.
Mhm.
Um, what are they doing, and how do you spot when an agency's gone into ghosting mode, and what do you do next? Because I think most reps treat silence like rejection instead of digestion.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the main thing is to just, again, be patient. If you have I feel like if customers go silent, there's usually a reason. And that reason is either whatever you have may not be relevant. They may truly be busy. Like right now, we're facing a federal government shutdown. Uh, food stamps and other benefits in the US. We're recording this on 10/29. So come 11/1, a lot of those benefits are in doubt. Agencies have a lot of other concerns in their mind in terms of just meeting the basic needs of their constituents outside of talking to vendors.
So
So
you meant October the 29th and starting on 1st of November.
1st of November, yeah.
Right. Okay. Got it. Got it. Got it. Okay.
So there's a lot of agencies we usually would be talking with a lot that, have other priorities right now because they're trying to figure out what they're going to do in the next couple of days. So I think it's a couple of things. It's either it's whatever you're talking about with them is not a priority and they're actually like truly busy, or it's another reason that maybe whatever you're doing is just simply not relevant.
And but how do the reps handle the pressure from above? Because I was on a chat with a prospective partner, and we were talking about how the forecast is full of fiction and theatre and the pressure to give commits when you can't possibly give those things, because the buyer buys when they are ready, not when your leadership or your investors want them to.
Mhm.
So, what advice would you give to reps to manage that upward pressure or that downward pressure coming from above?
Yeah, that's why they say it's forecasting is an art, not a science. And I'd be lying to you if I said I've mastered that art after 11 years, Marcus, because it's it's an ever changing practice. Um, but I think the main thing that like I try to always be as realistic as possible, even if that means I'm delivering bad news up front, right? Like a mentor has told me like it's incredibly important on the accuracy piece. Accurate doesn't necessarily mean high performing, right? Now that being said, do you generally get more of a slap on the wrist if you're uh, under that accuracy versus if you end up overachieving? Yes, but I think the biggest thing is just being realistic. Don't come in with a ton of hope if it doesn't actually exist. And at the end of the day, our job is to be the ambassador for our customer. Our the individual we are reporting to is our customer. So our customers should not feel any pressure or care about what we're forecasting up to leadership. And if that means uncomfortable internal conversations, like your job is to insulate your accounts from any type of internal pressure that the organization you work for may or may not be putting down on you. So I'd say just always take that approach where, your job is protecting and nurturing those relationships with your accounts. It doesn't really matter what the direction is from above if that direction is going to make you do something unnatural that you think would hurt your brand with your customer.
So, for those of you listening, go back and listen to the last 2 minutes again. Make sure that you actually digest what Parker has said, because your customer is who matters, whilst you still have to manage the politics going up from where you are internally. If you start applying pressure in order to try and meet your own leadership's desire to have something in forecast, what you will end up doing is destroy the relationship. And I've seen this happen time and time again. Working with clients who are selling into public sector, what I've seen over the last 20 years is that pressure repeatedly ended up killing relationships that took 12, 18, 24 months to develop. So, what advice would you give to people in order to be able to stay strong and give voice to their values, speaking upwards?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll say too, ServiceNow has been an amazing organization where I think I am enabled to fully lead the strategy with my customers and operate with a level of integrity. So this advice isn't coming from recency at my current vendor, but I've seen the a strategy I've seen not work is speaking up about it on the forecast call. You don't want 8 to 9 people on your team in these conversations. I think the most appropriate way to do it is to and, you might be in a situation with your leadership where this still doesn't work, and then that's another conversation, but I found that if you're able to come to leadership in a one-on-one and say, "Hey, this is why I'm reporting this. This is the challenge the customer's facing. This is the negative position I think we're gonna be put in if we do this." I find that if you're able to actually come with those facts, then there's a compelling narrative and a real story that makes sense. I think where leadership to play the perspective of somebody saying, "Hey, why don't you just go do this discount or go pressure your customer to do something?" If you don't have the information about the deal or the account, right? If you don't have that story, but you have some deal in pipeline, they're going to look at it and go, "Well, yeah, we assume you've been talking with the customer. We assume the deal is qualified. We assume these notes are accurate in the CRM. Why wouldn't you go do this?" Right? To take the flip side of the perspective. So if you don't have your story straight, you don't understand your customer, and you can't competently speak to what's going on in the account, it makes it harder for you to give a realistic answer that establishes that you know what you're talking about and you know your customer. Um, and that will hopefully, knock on wood, uh, help your leadership understand what's actually going on and why it doesn't make sense to do something that you may be being asked to do.
Well, I'm going to throw a spanner in the works here, because what I see over and over again is sales forecasts aren't really forecasts at all, they're theatre. And we often write them to protect ourselves, not to tell the truth. And that's the heart of the problem. And I think the system tends to reward optimism, not honesty. And sellers learn to act confident instead of curious. And leaders make the mistake of confusing activity for progress. And until we change that, we'll keep confusing performance with integrity. So your thoughts on that?
I like the performance for integrity and then the activity for progress. Yeah, it's interesting because you have me thinking of a couple things. There is a certain amount of theater in the sense of you need to constantly be building a narrative, right? And that narrative doesn't, I'm not saying that that narrative is not true, but you need to be constantly moving and progressing things. If that progression may not always align with the quarterly reporting of the organization, especially when we talk government. Um, and I think this is easier for more seasoned reps who've been around, know their customers, and have confidence. Like once you get, I don't know, I'm going to say 5 as a random benchmark, but I felt like after 5 years in the field, I felt pretty confident in defending my numbers and just saying, look, this is what it is, and then not taking things personally. When you're 1 to 2 years in the field and you don't have that confidence yet, it's not as easy to be certain about what the customer's doing. And when you're in these meetings and forecast calls, be unperturbed by inquisition, if that makes sense. I know that didn't directly answer your question,
It's
but
good. It's good enough.
yeah, I think there is a, no matter what, however you cut it, it's a game that'll always be played. I think at the end of the day, like I'm gonna go back to the keep it simple, like the kiss or kiss analogy, keep it simple, stupid. Just always try to be honest, accurate, and do your best at forecasting. And again, when you're in your one-on-ones, just be realistic. I know that's easy to say when you're not on plan, right? Like obviously, there's going to be certain situations where reps feel like they need to create a narrative, but I feel like in general, setting accurate expectations is better than providing pure unadulterated hope and then not living up to those expectations.
I think that's fair. I mean, often our job is making sure that we're talking customers off the ledge that we built for them. And if ghosting were a KPI, half the industry would be on President's Club. So I think most of the forecasts aren't really data; they're confessions that we haven't really made yet. So, what would change if accuracy became a measure of integrity instead of a perceived weakness?
If accuracy became a measure of integrity, well, what's interesting, accuracy is technically a measure of integrity because you have an integrity in the business, right? Like have a responsibility, you have a franchise as a rep, and your job is to accurately forecast and predict revenue for that franchise. Obviously, you have an earnings um, estimate, right? Like there's an estimate of what you're supposed to be doing, and you are supposed to overachieve on that estimate for your franchise, but that's not always the case. Um, you see this in the stock market. Companies will get ahead of the fact that they're going to be under earnings, and it's easier to let that happen earlier than there be a panic sell, you know, at time of earnings or at the end of a quarter. So I think and again, I think there's organizations that do this well. I feel like reps that choose optimism over accuracy set themselves up for more scrutiny. And then if we take the dynamic of company has a number, they demand number from rep, how do we make that process more integrous? I think it goes back to the understanding and knowing your customer. The more you know your stuff, the more faith leadership has in you and your ability to report and call on a number. So like the more you know your accounts, the more faith they're going to have in you as a rep, and the less inspection, the less asked to do unnatural things. If they don't have faith in you and your ability to execute in your patch and that you understand your accounts, and you're also providing a lot of hope in your forecast, they're going to want more involvement because there's going to be alarms going off. Like, wait, I don't know if like we need to get involved in what this individual is doing because they're consistently missing their call. They're not communicating effectively why their agencies aren't doing things. We don't really understand why there isn't any pipeline if they are reporting accurately that there's nothing. Like you need to really have that narrative prepared. And that's why preparing for your QBRs, your quarterly business reviews, making sure in your one-on-ones with leadership, in your engagement with your cross-functional teams, that you demonstrate a level of preparedness and a deep understanding of your accounts, because that will ultimately help defend your strategy and your customers. The more you can demonstrate that you are fully sufficient without the need for additional scrutiny and or intervention, the greater chance you have of fully maintaining that strategy with your account.
Well, I think, I mean, we've named the mess: bad incentives, false confidence, pressure from above, broken trust. If we stopped performing and started genuinely listening, empathizing, aligning, what would good actually look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. There's some radical ideas I have, like on totally changing the way that we are measured in terms of.
Go for it.
So, like for example, with government agencies, it would be very interesting if we were measured, if there was an additional incentive or measurement on pilots or projects kicked off that were around innovative solutions. That was a separate component of your quota. Obviously, everybody needs to drive revenue, but I think what we don't necessarily track is pure innovation plays, and those could be no cost proof of concepts. Those could be workshops. Those are things that you are doing to drive innovation within an account that don't necessarily generate revenue. And then
Partnering.
what was that?
Partnering.
Partnering. Yep, exactly. And then I think also shifting the way that we, and this is impossible to a degree, but shifting the way that we align our um, fiscal and quota alignment, right? Like governments do not operate, especially in most of the states in the U.S., do not operate on a calendar fiscal year. Aligning better to a state and local fiscal calendar, whether that's June to June or a different time frame, and having a different quota structure that reflects that could be an interesting way to eliminate. And again, I think ServiceNow does a great job of this, but I've worked at organizations in the past where all of the focus is on Q4. My customer's fiscal year is June 30th of 2027 for when this biennium ends. They don't care about December. Um, so I think to whatever degree organizations can better align around the way the customer functions in an enterprise that is calendar, um, the better outcomes there'll be for people. I'm curious what you've seen too, Marcus, because you've probably interviewed a lot of sellers in the UK that work with government. I'm sure they've communicated similar challenges.
Well, in my experience, more often than not, the owner, founder, or leadership team is obsessed with trying to meet their targets. And as a result, they're thinking about the customer, and they're not thinking with the customer or as the customer. And their emphasis is on being transactional,
Mm,
not on delivering the service that the public need. Um, and the citizen has almost been forgotten as an inconvenient afterthought. And we only have to look at what's happening in the US with the government shutdown, and look at the level of confusion that must be rippling through public sector because of that. And that seems to be an annual shitfest, if you don't mind me saying,
mm,
that is driven by partisan politics. It's got nothing to do with the good of the public. And I think on the one side, you've got the leadership of the vendors that are fixated on their selfish self-interest, and on the other side, you've got the partisan political positions of public servants who are serving
mm,
themselves or their partisan politics. They're not serving the public, and the net result is that public services have been largely run down. You only have to look at our water industry over here on this side of the pond. The amount of effluent in our rivers, the microplastics, the uh, rising prices of energy, everything that was regulated, the regulators have no teeth. So I don't. I think there needs to be a root and branch reorganization, but it needs to start somewhere. And the vendors actually have more control than I think government does, because government is, without wanting to be overly political, largely in the pockets of vested interests. You only have to look at the Data Use and Access Act that was passed in February 2025 over here, that effectively gave Palantir all of our national health and health records. It gave Google, Amazon, Meta, and large tech companies visibility of all of our online usage. And it gave all of those companies the right to come to me as an individual creator of intellectual property and say that they want to see my IP for research purposes, and then they can steal it, repackage it, and then sell it back to the market without even giving me credit, let alone a single penny. So vendors need to take a position where they are thinking as the customer, they're restructuring how they comp their reps, how they measure their reps. They need to align with their customers, and we need to start putting the public back into the heart of what they do. And until that happens, I think to a large extent, it's essentially a mafia shakedown. I don't think I'm being wildly unfair. Thoughts?
So, I will not comment on the state of the UK legislation that's being passed over there, but I will say, I think the theme we keep going back to on this podcast is making sure that we're centering the customer first and foremost in all of our interactions, regardless of what the position is of the vendors that we work for. And again, I feel lucky that at ServiceNow I have more resources than I've had at any other company, and I feel like I am truly enabled to come in and say, "What do you need?" And then whether it's workshops, design, engagements, we can resource around that customer and meet them where they're at. And our leadership team has shown a lot of respect and understanding of where our agencies are, especially in light of Fed changes. And I feel like we're in a really strong place in the sense of that I feel is very resonant with our customers. Like they see it in the way that we engage with them. Um, but I think the number one thing to reps out there that I'd say that we haven't already covered is you may have a lot of anxiety right now. There's more fear, uncertainty, and doubt, I feel like, in state and local uh, now than there has been in years, likely since '08. Um, Continue to be patient, continue to be calm. The overall state and local government funding picture has still gone up year over year dramatically. We have significantly more funding. I have this statistic in the beginning of my book, but it's something like it's gone up 2x over the last 5 to 7 years in terms of overall SLG funding. So while things look bleak and there's a lot of federal uncertainty now, there is still funding for these large programs that create meaningful outcomes in the communities that you work with. And this isn't the time to clam up and jump ship. This is the time to double down, continue to engage and spend more time with the agencies that you partner with, and really ensure that you are doing everything you can in these challenging times to be a partner.
Okay, let's take the conversation in a slightly different tack. I'd be really curious to start looking at blind spots, because I think if we look at what goes wrong in sales, whether it's public or private sector, very often salespeople have blind spots, buyers have blind spots.
Mm.
So, what are the blind spots that you've learned to look for, and the ones that you now catch yourself on early?
Yeah, there's two things that are on total opposite sides of the coin. I remember when I was at Citrix, our CISO did a Q&A, and they said, what's the number one thing that you're annoyed by when sales reps reach out to you? And he said, my number one thing that annoys me the most is when somebody says, tell me what your challenges are. He's like, I put out a yearly cybersecurity strategy and plan that lists all of my challenges. I want a rep to come to me understanding what those are. And similarly, most CIOs in state government will say, you need to understand the strategic plan. Like, what have I put forward publicly as what our initiatives are before you meet with me? And I think there is a tendency to over rotate sometimes. And I've done this in the past, specifically when I've been in roles where I'm selling at a greenfield or customers that don't own what we're selling, where you come in and you over plan and you're like, okay, we found this thing. We're going to come in. We have 30 minutes to tell them what we can do to solve that thing. um, I think there's a balance there because on the other side of the coin, um, you can't necessarily be fully curious and just say, "Hey, we'd love to get to know you." But I have heard CIOs say, "I really miss when a rep would just ask me, what are my challenges?" So I think there needs to be a balance where you can't overprescribe. You do still need to be curious. And sometimes I've had a blind spot where I'm like, I know exactly what they've put forward. We're going to craft something that specifically meets this, but we're not doing enough inquisitiveness to ask questions around uh, that problem further. So I feel like there's a balance that can be had where you are understanding the customer, but you're also still really being consultative and taking in their feedback when you're engaging.
I go a little bit further and look at what's not being said, because all too often, if you're stuck in the middle of the crisis or the problem, you won't see everything. So you've got perception, but you lack perspective. And I think that's one of the key roles that a good rep will bring to the party. It's helping them see beyond their reach, and help them grasp what is possible and possible for them, by introducing things that maybe they won't have considered. Because, like we said right earlier on, government works at a particular pace. The tech companies are typically working at a much faster pace, and they're also working on quarterly reporting.
Mhm.
And I'm minded of the peace negotiations between the US and the Chinese at the end of the Korean War. At the end of the Korean War, the US delegation rented 3 floors of the Hilton for 3 months. The Chinese delegation rented a 5 bedroom house for 3 years. I think that that negotiation was won at the signing of the lease because they were playing the long game and they weren't in a hurry, whereas they knew that their counterparty was trying to get things done within a very short space of time. And we have to slow things down to speed things up. So you talk about doing the little things right. What are those things in government sales the little things that we can do in order to ensure that we are doing the right things at the right time, in the right way, with the right people?
Yeah, great question. So, and I've got this written on a post-it note beside my desk because it's a reminder. These are all things I think when you're early in your career, you're a master at because you're so focused on the tactics versus the broader term, and they're good things to remind yourself to do. So like main thing is do not make assumptions. Remember to ask questions. Remember to be curious. Do the little things right. In the from the perspective of ensure preparedness, right? Like read the strategic plan, do your usual whatever your 3 by 3 research that might be LinkedIn news clippings, and then strategic plan or legislative or funding ask from the agency. Um, ensure that you're preparing with your teams, all like very basic sales 101 things are just, professional 101. But I understand, especially when things are crazy, and I'm guilty of this too. It's easy to overlook some of this in the interest of productivity in doing as much as possible at one time. Sometimes you need to take a step back and slow things down a bit in order to get back to the place where you're operating at the degree you'd like to be.
Well, I think you've touched on a couple of things there, which is that we tend to substitute haste for speed and we tend to substitute efficiency for effectiveness. And the net result of that is that we don't put in enough time in practice. I always teach my clients, and we run 4 2-hour practice labs a month,
Mm.
precisely because you shouldn't practice in front of the customer. You should practice in a safe space. And I always tell my clients for every hour you're in front of the customer, 3 hours of prep and practice. Um, if you do that, your close rate goes through the roof. If you don't do that, you show up, you butcher it, and then you get ghosted, and then you spend your life chasing. And you can easily get a 60% increase in production and in performance by simply adopting that simple shift. But politically, it doesn't normally sit well because management wants to see activity rather than meaningful action. So, um, if we think about the questions you mentioned, asking the right questions. What are the questions that sellers should be asking but almost never do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in terms of customer engagement, I think the number one thing to ask is really understanding what the programs are that that customer supports. Um, you should know that via your research coming in. But again, that's something where you might not have a lot of agencies don't have a huge digital presence, and you may not genuinely be able to figure out what are you responsible for delivering. It may not be as simple as I'm the SNAP administrator, and you know that person does SNAP, which is supplemental nutrition assistance. So understand what the programs are that they're supporting, how they're navigating changes, what are the big programs or bills that they're following in their respective states' legislative session. And one thing I like to do just to show preparedness is I'll say, we noticed in your strategic plan, or we found a news clipping, we saw something where you said that your key priorities are this. We're prepared to talk to those, but we wanted to give you the floor. Could you give us more information or confirm if these are your challenges or what else is a key for you? So we'll mention essentially, hey, we've read your plan. We're prepared to speak to those, but what is actually burning for you right now, and give them the opportunity to either agree and say, yep, those are still my priorities. We actually already have a solution for 2 of those 4, but these are the 2 we're focused on. Or, you know what, so much has changed since that was written. These are really the key things that I'm looking for help on.
I think it's important to understand what their policies are for adoption and approval. I
Hmm.
think it's also important to understand who owns the outcome, who is the risk avoider, who's the financial owner, and understanding that cast of characters, and particularly get to the bottom of who the invisible influencers are, because I almost never see that happening, and they almost no one spends any time trying to work out who's in the second room or the third room,
Mm.
because you can sell it to your champion, But if it doesn't make it past the second room, it's never going to get bought, and you're going to end up with a ghosted pipeline. And
Mm,
even if it makes it through there, if the final approvers and the people who are going to sign on the dotted line and hand over the cash aren't on board, then you're in deep trouble. So we need to spend more time in research. And one of the things that drives me insane is the number of salespeople who have WeHap as their primary sales process, wing it and hope and a prayer, showing up and then vomiting up a demo
mm,
without actually working out whether or not the customer's even ready to have that conversation. So
yeah.
and the other part, which I think is really critical, is understanding what happens after go live. Who's accountable? Because you've got four forces at work. You've got the push to change. That's typically pain. You've got the pull towards that better future that they're hoping to be able to implement. But then you have this inertia, which is the magnetic gravitational pull of inaction. And then you have the anxiety and fear of change. And unless you've mapped all of those out across the three rooms, chances are you're going to find yourself in a position where someone will block it. And often it's killed in the corridor between one of those rooms. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the big piece that you mentioned, great question to ask, and a key component is whoever you're talking to, likely it's somebody else that's actually going to support, be a part of implementation. Who are those other influencers? Who are the people that are responsible for delivering on something? How can we get their advice, their feedback, and engage with them as we move forward on a project? And then I think that one of the biggest things you mentioned that I want to harp on is what happens after this is sold. Understanding the delivery, because that's the number one area I've seen things fall apart in is during delivery. And a lot of vendors don't manage delivery in house. So you start to get a third party involved, and it's critical to understand who at the customer might be involved in the delivery process because it could be different than whoever the person or persons were that you were working with upfront um, pre the deal closing. So having that identified and having a plan, and we're actually working on a strategy for this currently, me and my direct team, so we can better keep in touch and engage and ensure that post delivery, the outcomes the customer was hoping to achieve that we know are possible can actually be reached because so much is reliant on the operational cadence during delivery, as well as the enablement, the training, and the capacity of the customer to ensure that the outcomes they're hoping to achieve are actually going to be realistic.
So, my reading on that is that if reps only change one habit tomorrow, that would make the biggest difference. It's not to win the bid, it's to deserve the renewal.
Yep, 100%. Yeah, and I think that's a big piece of it is just really understanding. And I didn't realize this until, 5 years ago. Now that I'm saying it feels like a long time. But I had one project where I was so certain that this was going to be a lights out implementation. And we were so excited about it. We spent 18 months in planning, did 3 months of SAL revisions. Like I thought it was impossible that we missed anything. And there ended up being one key technical factor at the customer site that was overlooked that resulted in us delivering 20 weeks late. And it was something that we wouldn't have thought to ask either of us until it came up. Um, so I'll say it's one of those things where there's no easy button. It's not like, oh, if you ask these three questions, you're going to have everything because every sale is different. But I think it is critical to to your point, put that at the upfront and make sure you're asking those questions and understanding it, and continue to hold your partners accountable. Um, just because you are running a cadence with a partner does not mean that you need to continue to work with them if you're noticing a negative pattern, and raise the alarm quickly. Every rep is going to have implementations go south when you're not owning the process, or even if you are in the process, if you are doing the services directly. But it's important to make sure that you're holding those people accountable and really raising that alarm so it does not happen, if the same situation does not happen to another rep.
One of the most useful lessons that I've learned over the last 5 years, and I now teach religiously, is run to the sound of gunfire. Go and find evidence that you are wrong. Go and find people who can prove you wrong, and always make that critically core to your sales process. Because if you don't, it will come and bite you later. And far too often, I see salespeople operating with happy ears and rose-tinted spectacles, thinking, "Oh, we've covered all bases." If you're not asking the question, "What have I missed? Where might I have misunderstood? What have I got wrong? How have I put my bias into this frame?" And as a result, when it lands with the customer, second room, third room, it's going to come back and my champion will end up with egg on their face.
Mhm.
What can go wrong? Pre-morteming, I think, is one of the most useful things that we can do. And in terms of prepping for your QBRs, doing a solid pre-mortem so that you can defend and justify why you should not be putting the customer under pressure at this stage, why doing so will backfire and will cost all of that sunk investment and lose it is really key. And I think that's something that requires a lot of courage. But that then comes to speak to the middle management layer, because I think middle managers are too often the people who were good as individual contributors and managed to meet quota, but their job when they become a middle manager is not to meet quota, it's to empower other people to meet quota. And I think too often they then become spreadsheet jockeys, they become reporting addicts, and they're more worried about trying to make senior leadership happy rather than tell the truth. And it keeps coming back to that transparency and honesty that we talked about half an hour ago. I'm really interested in the human side now. Um, who or what has most influenced how you sell or think? Books, thinkers, people?
Yeah, so when I first got into the field, I was really big on Brian Burns' Brutal Truth About Sales and Selling podcast. He's changed it. There's a different name for it. And then he also wrote a book called The Maverick Method. What I liked about it is he had different enterprise sellers coming on every week, and they would just talk kind of like we are on, like, hey, this is what's actually true. This is what's kind of BS. These are the misconceptions. And it was interesting hearing the way different companies and people that were selling like tractors, right? Not people in tech sales like me, the way that they would approach sales. And I remember one of the big takeaways I heard was like, and I studied game theory in college. I was an economics major. They were saying that they took a game theory approach to sales. So they'd actually go in and whiteboard out the different ways that the conversation could go and preempt that so they could really understand a flow. I do that on like a smaller scale. And if you're not familiar with game theory, go to GPT, Gemini, whatever your AI of choice is, and ask for a rundown of the prisoner's dilemma. And you can apply that framework to your deals. Um, Outside of that, spin selling, like that book when I was first getting into sales provided me with like a very easy referenceable framework. That was not too challenging. Um, Now, like pretty much, I'm in the last few years, like I've mostly just been listening to more industry people. Like Scott Galloway is a thought leader and an author whose tone was incredibly helpful for me. Like that's who was a huge influence for me in my book, and he has an awesome podcast and a couple books that are really good. And then I watch a lot of local news, so like I'm really big on just understanding like I think at a certain point, you can always get a refresher and you always have your sales trainings. Those are always good reminders and the good things to reinforce the skills that you already have. But I think the way you can really get more advanced as a state and local seller is really understanding what is happening with your customer and understanding policy shifts, understanding things that are happening at the leadership level in agencies. And your municipality, your state will likely have some type of tribune or news source that's not, the New York Times, that has really relevant information on what's happening at the local politics scene. And I think following that is what's most impactful for staying relevant.
So tell me what your best mistake was.
Yeah. So I think my best mistake, um, I'm going to give a customer one and then a professional one. I think my best mistake was a deal that very early in my career I lost. And we figured out that the reason we lost the deal is that we weren't talking to the right people. So we had a faction in the entity that was super bullish on what we could provide them. Um, and we didn't understand that there were other people that we needed to get on our side that were actually the final decision makers who were a firm no. And that was the first time I realized, okay, I really need uh, to be taking my happy years off on the positive prospect and just becoming deeper in the account and really understanding who's the operator and the owner. Like these were people on a decision committee that were heavy influencers of provided policy and governance, but ultimately the owner, the business outcome, the people driving the business outcome were the ones. So learning that early helped me be more effective. And then I think professionally, leaving Google, right? Like people thought I was crazy for leaving Google, and it was an amazing company. I enjoyed all 4 of my years there. But without that shift where I was kind of being pushed more into covering higher education and AI research firms, I wouldn't have gotten to the level of deepness that I'm now at, I feel like. in state and local, specifically in my patch in Washington and Alaska, and I would have never written my book, which comes out on 10/30 on Amazon. So I always think about just like the different way your life can go based on these seemingly not like, a job shift. You don't think that's going to be the end of your world, right? Or a massive change in anything. But I'm like, everything that occurred post me coming to ServiceNow has now led to me eventually writing this and being on this podcast with you, Marcus.
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
Um, so, have you ever been blindsided? A moment that gave you a trip to the woodshed and a beating with humility, or gave you perspective?
Yeah, the blind side, I mean, again, I think it was actually that same deal where without getting too deep, I actually write about this deal in the book. So, spoiler alert, if you want the full story, you can read it in the book. But it was when I was at Oracle, I was competing with another internal business unit. And um, we had worked on a proposal that we were going to jointly share with the customer the next day. And the definition of blindsiding, I show up and they've changed the proposal and put in a bunch of other things that were positive for them and negative for us. And so in the room with 30 people, we had to adjust on the fly and de-escalate and provide the right information. And me and my engineer, Ashish Naveen, shout out to Ashish. I think he's still doing sales engineering and architecture work down in California. We were at the Hilton in downtown Seattle until 2 in the morning, putting together the most deep possible reply. And we were at the customer site 9 a.m. the next day to deliver that perspective. And that perspective ended up saving the customer a lot of time and money because it gave them the data that they needed in order to hold the other party accountable.
If you had a golden ticket and you could go back to whisper in the ear of your idiot 23-year-old self, what would you tell him?
I tell them to not be so worried. I think when you're early in your career, every call is, this is going to be it, right? Like this is my worth is defined by every daily interaction. And there's just so much uncertainty because you don't have the confidence that the confidence, the compensation, and the mandate from the confidence from your leadership in what you're doing. So I'd say going back on it, I would just be not as concerned with every call, and I wouldn't be beating myself up as much on metrics. I would just enjoy the moment and focus more on learning from the mistakes and trust the process. Understand that what happens to you at 23 won't define your career, um, and really take the ability to learn from those early years, find mentors, be okay with trusting the process and just making mistakes and don't be so concerned with what that next thing is.
I'd take that a little bit further in that you're going to learn from your mistakes if you take the time to reflect. If
Mm,
you just move on to the next deal, the next deal, the next deal, you're not. And I see far too many salespeople of 20 years standing with not 20 years experience, but 1 year, 20 times over.
mm.
And take the scar tissue and use it as your best teacher. And the secret to surviving in sales is stop pretending that you're in control. Recognize that your customer will be your best teacher. And you've got to adapt because what worked 20 years ago isn't necessarily going to work now. It was a very different context then. Customers now are exceptionally well informed. There was a time when salespeople were the single biggest source of further education for customers. Now, to a large extent, they're brought in 76% of the way through the sales process or the buying process. And unless you turn up and you are timely, hyper relevant, prepared, personally valuable, you're just going to be kicked into touch. You're just column fodder, or worse, you're an unwelcome interruption at the end of a long chain of abuse. So let's come back to your book and end where your book really begins with integrity. And for anyone listening, the book is called State and Local Government Sales Beyond the Bid by Parker Mills. If every seller in the public sector took one idea from Beyond the Bid, what would you want it to be?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think the number one thing from the book in the beginning, we really focus on just the basics, understanding how your customers fund projects, what they do. And then as we get farther in the book, I get more into enterprise deal strategy. So I do stories of the lessons learned and what I've lost, and what I've won, right? Like where have I had success, where have we had failure, and what did I learn from those processes? And I think the key in each one of those stories goes back to the basic components. Before the deal, understand what the customer is doing, understand their funding, really have that full picture. when you're in the process of the deal, make sure you're understanding what the outcome is that your product or service is going to drive. What's the ROI? What's the impact to the resident? And make sure you're quantifying that. And then post sale, resource around the customer. So it's understanding those three, kind of the three phases of the deal: the pre-planning and the understanding, the solutioning and the presentation component, and then the success piece. All very simple, but in the book I go in great detail on how you can do that. I think that's kind of the main takeaway, is just be prepared at each phase.
So if we think about how we can help sellers into the public sector, how can we help them see that they're not just closing deals, they're shaping how citizens actually live?
Yeah, I'd say look at case studies. Like, we'll go to there's a large organization called NASCIO, National Association of State CIOs. They do a yearly conference where they give out awards. You can go to their website and look up those awards. Look at what states are doing and the impact that it's having on residents. Look at the case studies for the vendor that you work for and see what they're doing in state and local. Um, there's some really cool stuff. And at the end of the day, especially if you're in technology like me, technology is becoming the primary vector for engaging. If whether it's paying your utility bill, getting benefits, getting your driver's license. So I think having the mindset or perspective, or for me, like my why in government, is being able to help take my background and what I understand from a technology landscape and solutioning perspective and apply that to the biggest challenges that agencies face in serving their residents. Um, when you have the ability to work on projects like that meaningfully impact the way your neighbors engage with government, that's what I feel like ends up being super rewarding. And also, so many people stick around in government. It's not like private sector where people rotate in a role every 2 to 3 years. There's some agencies that I'm still talking with the same customer 10 years later, when I first started in the role, or first started selling into state and local. So there's something really rewarding about the longevity of building relationships and knowing these same people. And that goes for the partner community too. Every conference, every roadshow I go to, it's the same 30 people I've been seeing for the last 10 years. So there is something rewarding about the relationships that you build in this space too.
Excellent. We've come to time. How can people get hold of you?
You can reach out to me via email. That is parkermills@stateandlocalsales.com, or find me on LinkedIn. If you look for Parker Mills on LinkedIn and look for the currently employed by ServiceNow, you'll be able to find me. Feel free to ping me. Always happy to hop on a call or exchange a couple ideas over email.
Parker Mills, thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. This has been a pleasure.
So to wrap this up, what I've really enjoyed about this conversation is that it exposed that selling into government isn't the real challenge. Selling with integrity and patience is. And I think Parker made it really clear that integrity isn't a slogan, it's a skill. It's slowing down when everyone else is rushing. It's telling the truth when hope would be an easier sell. And the best sellers don't win the bid, they deserve the renewal. So if you take only one thing from today, make it this: think beyond the quarter, beyond the customer, even beyond the deal. Because when you sell with integrity, you don't just change your forecast, you change lives. So with that, stay safe and happy selling. Bye-bye.